Tania?
Okay. So welcome back from this short break. And now we invite you to stay here for our keynote speaker number 1 presentation, who is going to be introduced by our conference chair, Dr. Mónica Cárdenas-Claros. Mónica, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Tania. Well, first of all, welcome and thank you, Phil, once again for accepting this invitation to be the keynote speaker. Just to tell you about something about who Phil Hubbard is, he's a senior lecturer emeritus in the Stanford University Language Center, working in the field of computer-assisted language learning since the early 1980s. He has published in the areas of code theory, research methodology, evaluation, teacher education, learner training, and listening. He served on the task force that developed the TESOL standards and is associate editor of Computer-Assisted Language Learning and the Language Learning and Technology journals. His recent projects focus on COL as a transdisciplinary field, teaching effectively with technology and teacher support from informal language learning. So welcome, Phil. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Monica, and thanks to all of the various groups and individuals that made this possible. I'm really excited to actually be talking at a conference that is specifically devoted to listening. Specifically devoted to listening. This is an area that I've been interested in for most of my career. What I'm going to talk about today is going to be a shift for a lot of, I think, both teachers and researchers. We've done quite a bit of very valuable work, both in developing good practice and in the research underlying that practice about ways in which we can help students be effective listeners within the classroom setting and even outside of it, but with often highly structured programs, highly structured applications that give them a lot of flexibility, but still hand everything over to them kind of on a plate. What I'm going to talk about is how we prepare them for going out into the world, what's referred to sometimes as the digital wilds, and being armed with both the skills and the knowledge of the tools that can help them be more effective learning on their own. As a quick backdrop for this, for about 20 years, I taught a course in advanced listening to matriculated graduate students at Stanford. So these are students who already have a high enough TOEFL score to be able to get into an English medium university, but still either showed some deficiencies in listening or believed they had them, and so self-selected into our listening classes. That gave me a very nice sandbox for trying out ideas. And my classes were small. A typical class might have 8 to 10 students in it. I had a lot of individual meetings with them, usually 4 to 5 per 10-week quarter. And so I got a lot of feedback from the students about what was working and what wasn't. Back in 2007, 2008, I did a couple of formal research studies on this, but for the most part, this has just emerged out of what you might think of as somewhat informal action research. I put the link to the slides on this opening slide here. I also put it into the chat, and I encourage you to stick with me and go through the current slideshow, but there are a lot of links in that, and I know what a pain it is to try to type those in later or remember them if you don't have a recording of this. So That's why the slides are up there and available. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why we would do self-directed informal listening, and also a bit about what that means, particularly the informal part, because I define it somewhat differently from the way that some other people might. I'm then going to talk about 3 important skills for students trying to work on their own to have. And by the way, this is also really important for teachers to have. So figuring out what the right resources are for them, the right materials for listening, understanding the available technologies and learning how to control those, and then how to go through the material in ways that support learning rather than simply comprehension. Okay, so for this first area, informal learning is typically defined as learning outside the classroom. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the ways that teachers, or the reasons teachers can support it, a little bit about the ways. I have a chapter in the Handbook of Informal Learning, Language Learning, that came out in 2020. The references are on the final slide for those of you who would like to look some of this up. And so some of the material for this talk is coming out of that chapter. And then a good question, maybe directed more towards the normal classroom teacher rather than this audience who already has an interest in listening, is, why listening? One of our introductory speakers talked about how listening scores so low with students compared to some of the other skills. And I think this is something that we've been dealing with in language, formal language teaching and learning throughout all this development of new technology that makes listening both easier and arguably more important, because so much information is available now. An area very close to me is learner training, and so I'll also be talking about that and why that's such an important component of the teacher support for this informal learning. Okay, so a couple of dimensions here, 3 dimensions actually. The first one has to do with direction. A lot of language learning, in some cases virtually all of it, is teacher directed. You have textbooks, you have curricula, you have materials, and those are brought into the classroom. Students are assigned homework from them, but it's all really under the direction of the teacher, and the students are often expect that. Self-directed on the far side means the teacher's out of the picture altogether. There's also this dimension of intentional versus incidental learning. One of our later speakers, Maribel, is going to be talking about, I think, about some of her work with incidental vocabulary learning. So intentional learning basically means there is a reason. It can be fairly light, that a student is engaging in something in the hopes that they'll learn from it, not just experience it. Whereas incidental learning means you're doing something else and you're maybe picking up some language along the way. And then there's formal versus informal. So formal is not just teacher directed, but formal means it's structured. And informal means there is a somewhat absence of structure handed to you either through a textbook or through some other curricular device. What's important to me is, this is where I said I was a little bit different from some people. Some people equate informal with incidental learning, and I see them as really different, even though they overlap significantly. And I have found this article by Marsick and Watkins where they said that informal learning is usually intentional but not highly structured. And I think that's important, that there's a difference between simply exposing yourself to language as a learner and exposing yourself to language with the intent of getting something out of it other than just the content or the entertainment experience or the interaction socially. So the learning involves something sticking so that you can make use of it later. And importantly, each of these pairs lies to me along what I call a fuzzy continuum. It's a continuum because you have things that are intentional, you have things that are incidental, but you also have things that are in between. So you might be intentionally in a class, but incidentally notice a poster on the wall that has a word, and the word and the picture go together, and suddenly you know what that word means. You didn't intend at all to learn from that. And similarly, there's intentional things that go on in an incidental setting where you pick up some new expression, maybe even in your native language, and you write it down because you think it's cool and you want to hang on to it. I call it a fuzzy continuum because it's not like you can quantify this and say, okay, this is 80% intentional and 20% incidental, or teacher-directed versus self-directed. Especially even in a fairly structured class, students have a lot of control over what they do or don't do. We really saw this when there was the sudden change to online learning because of the COVID pandemic. A lot of students were not able to be self-directed in a way that was kind of required under those circumstances. And a lot of teachers, I'm tempted to say the great majority of teachers, didn't know how to support that. So there was a breakdown on both sides, certainly in the U.S. A key concept here, if you're going to go in this self-directed, informal direction as a learner, or if you're going to try to guide your learners in that way, is pleasure. People will very rarely deliberately engage in something unless they get some pleasure out of it. And so this is part of that self-direction, is to just orient students toward things that they get some intrinsic enjoyment out of, but at the same time can learn from. And this goes all the way back to Crash and probably before that even, but it pops up again in Toffoli and Sackett's work on informal learning. A couple of years ago, there was a special issue of Language Learning and Technology on call in the digital wilds, and if you would like to know more about some of the research here, particularly across a range of skills, not just listening, then I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't. Language Learning and Technology, as Monica mentioned, I'm one of the associate editors there, but it's from its inception in 1997, it's been a fully online, fully open journal. And so anybody who can get to that URL can get to the material in it. I mentioned that I had this opportunity to teach a class for 20 years, all the way through spring of 2020, so that my last experience with this class was with an online version of it. And the goal of that class, it's a 10-week, because we're on the quarter system at Stanford, 10-week course. We don't have any follow-up courses that involve listening, so this is the last class that a student would take that had any formal listening content in it. And my goal is to give students not only a good experience where they improve their listening and build their vocabulary during the class, but that they leave the class prepared to be able to continue the language journey on their own. And so I'll be drawing both directly and indirectly from that experience in the rest of this talk. So I mentioned that there was value in having teacher support, and I think it goes beyond that. It's really critical for there to be teacher support of this. If you have a structured class and you work students through that structure and you get to the end of that class, it's unlikely they will either be motivated or prepared to continue on their own. Doesn't mean they won't continue learning the language if they're using the language, but they're not going to be able to do it as efficiently or effectively. It's a hard sell for teachers to be able to give up class time and to be able to give up their position of authority to let students in and to move them toward this autonomy a lot of times. What I noticed is when I started doing this, I actually had better response in my class. So just for the short term of when you're teaching your class, there's some real value in doing this. Students do begin to take more control. They're not autonomous, but they start making movements toward autonomy. They start building their own confidence, and that's a big part of this. If students are used to having the teacher tell them what to do, they start building confidence in being able to do this, and especially the teacher monitoring that they're doing it because they want to do it rather than because a teacher tells them they have to. And also, there's this ability for students to be able to get together with each other. This is an important part of my class, is I take class time and let them get into groups so they can share their challenges and their successes, swap ideas about how to learn effectively on their own and what materials are out there that could be of interest to other students. Again, my ultimate goal is a long-term one, and so the long-term gains, and I put possible here because we can't guarantee this, certainly, and it will vary from student to student. When I was doing more intensive research on what was going on with this, I became quite aware of the differences even within a small group, and even with students who might be from the same country and in the same general field. I worked a lot with science and engineering students, but they would be different in terms of how well they were able to take on this self-direction, and also what kinds of techniques they found useful, what kinds of materials they were interested in. So there's a lot of individualization that happens here. The teacher can start that, the student's going to continue it. So I think they're more likely to continue. I did actually check in with some a few weeks after the course was over to see if they were continuing. We know that there's so much online already for certainly all major languages, and increasingly even for ones spoken by a much more limited number of speakers. Here where I presume there's the conference itself is being offered in English, and Spanish also has huge numbers of speakers and opportunities for picking up so much online that can support your listening if you're doing Spanish as a second language. This is just going to continue. And then in a nice article in Modern Language Journal in 2016, Chun, Kern, and Smith noted that as students become more autonomous, then it helps the development of their digital literacies. And digital literacies continues to be a big buzzword for us. Okay, this gets to why listening. So I'll go over this quickly because, again, I think I have a sympathetic audience here that I might not have if I were talking at a general English teacher or researcher conference. We know that listening is the way that certainly people acquire their first language. It's a very important part of that. Yes, interaction is critical, but listening is still the major channel. We know there's a strong connection between listening and vocabulary, just as there is for reading. Already talked about this expansion of online resources, but most importantly, ones that are free. There's greater access, both on a static computer, even though technically I'm on a laptop. I've got it set up in a static position here, but there's mobile as well. And then this increased presence of all the digital comprehension supports. And there's quite a list there, and it's not an exhaustive list. This is what Cárdenas-Claros and Gruba refer to as compensatory help options. And I encourage you to take a look at that paper if you haven't, to see what some of the other supports are for learners in listening. Okay, a few key assumptions as we move on. I'm going to be focusing just on one-way listening. So the kind of listening basically you're doing now. While someone could interrupt me if they wanted to, you've been asked not to. You've been asked to mute. So even though this is in real time at the moment, it's still one way. And this is what you get when you listen to audio or video online. Interactive listening is really important, and we do work with that as well. But for these purposes, and also because for students, it's a lot easier to do one-way listening. All they have to do is pop a YouTube video on, and they're able to be working with language. They don't have to find an interlocutor. In moving toward this self-directed work, my sense is this is something that's better done with intermediate, even high intermediate, B1 level on the Common European Framework scale or above. The research I've seen suggests that even students who are good at being more self-directed in other areas, when they start something new, when they're still building confidence, they like the support, they need the support. It still doesn't mean you can't bring some of this in, but in terms of building a whole course around it the way that I have, it's going to work better, I think, with the higher levels. And then if the teacher's going to be helping to support, if the teacher is going to be guiding the students in doing this, the teacher needs to know a lot and needs to be very reflective when trying new things out, looking at what other people have done, if there's relevant work there, and then trying it out, and then going through that reflective cycle of trying to prepare something that you think is going to work, monitoring it while it's happening. If it's happening in the classroom in a practice session for students, for example, or during that, if the students are doing it completely on their own, being sure to pull in the feedback from them that's going to help you help the students down the road or help the next batch of students. I worked on a book in 2017 called Teaching English Reflectively with Technology, and there are links to that book there. Has a lot of good case studies by teachers who are doing either formal or informal action research on their students using technology for English language learning, and doing it in a way that is that has a reflective cycle built into it. Okay, this brings me to the last part of kind of the setup of all of this. And I spend a lot of time on the setup because I think there are so many important concepts here. This last one, learner training. There is a sense that if we've got students who are, what you want to call them, millennials, digital natives, or some other term, that they already know how to use technology and we don't need to do anything to help them very much, other than if we have some new application, we might give them some basic technical training in that. My experience is that you need to do more. I have tried to do something in the last 2.5 years, something completely new to me, which is to learn how to play the double bass. The double bass is that big instrument used in orchestras, but it's also used in folk music, in American bluegrass, in American traditional music. And I did this because 2.5 years ago I started dating someone who was a guitarist, who is now my wife, and I wanted to be able to play music with her. I played trombone, a brass instrument, in high school and college, but hadn't played any music for about 40 years. So I started from scratch, really, with the double bass, and luckily was able to avoid teaching myself. I immediately went to lessons. But my music instructor sent me this as a way of encouraging me not to try to learn on my own. So I'll let the picture speak for itself. This is not the way you play the bass. So I've been working in this area for a number of years. I published my first work in learner training back in 2004, where, and again, this was a blend of taking research concepts and my practice experience, and I put together a series of 5 principles there. In 2013, I published an article in the Calico Journal where I tried to make the case for this using 4 strands of evidence, 4 strands of arguments to back up why learner training was so important to build into your class, not just for listening, but for really for anything that involved technology. And then in 2014, I started working with Glenn Stockwell, who some of you may know, on working with him on a learner training project. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this because I think it shows what can happen when you're an established teacher using technology, in this case technology that he had developed himself. It's an app for practicing listening and vocabulary outside of class. And what happens when you build a learner training cycle into that? So I'm going to take you, I hope this will work. Let me open this up a little bit more. So this is a talk we gave in 2014. The goal here was to see when Glenn took what was this existing app that he had used for several years and published work on with his students, and see what would happen when he devoted a little bit of class time each week to doing some learner training with it. And so he and I were on Skype week by week talking about how he would go about this, and then getting feedback on it. It was really his work, but I was there to support the learner training element of it. I don't have time to go into great detail about the app itself, but I want to go to to this slide here. Every year he taught the same course, which was an English course for incoming law students at Waseda University. These are students who are going to be practicing law in Japan and probably are not highly motivated to improve their English, but have this required course. He has these two sections of it every year. He'd been working with his students in 2013 and had given them a little bit of technical training going in to try to prepare them. And so this is a slide on differences in training. A framework that I co-developed in 2008 to add to my original 5-principle framework talked about the differences between technical, strategic, and pedagogical training. Noting that in most published work, students are, if they're given training at all, they're only given technical training. So how to actually use this, what are the controls? Strategic training is about when to use them and how to use them in order to meet learning goals. And then the pedagogical training, which I think of as teacher training for students, which is why I use that term, it gives them the why. So in my class, for example, I talk about top-down and bottom-up and interactive processing. I talk to students about cognitive resource limitations. I bring in bits from psychology and from second language acquisition in order to help them become better learners. And so that's the pedagogical training. So he started doing this. And he gave up a little bit of his class time. The class only meets once a week. The students work on their own optionally with this app. And the following week they come in and they have to take a quiz based on the material that's presented in the app. And so the amount of time they spend practicing on it is entirely up to them, and how they practice it is entirely up to them. This is what I found remarkable. The 2013 class, the only training was, one session of basic technical training and then a little bit of follow-up if students were having difficulty. So we used the 2013 class as a pseudo control group. The quizzes, the material, it's all the same from year to year. So in 2013, these were the average scores on the various quizzes. And in 2014, this was the average score. So when the class started out in 2014, before they had any training or very much training, they actually scored significantly less on the quiz than the 2013 class had. As time went on, and as the training sessions went on, which included not only the teacher-fronted demonstration, but also students working in groups, speaking to each other in Japanese about how they were using it and what was working, and even washing back on the instructor, on Glenn, to say, now that we're talking about this, here are some ways you could change your app to make it better. And so he started getting feedback that he hadn't gotten before, because the students were able to talk to each other without having to go straight to the teacher with comments. Anyway, this, given 40 students, this became statistically significant around mini quiz 4, and then just kept growing. The interesting thing was, it's, if you are just looking at the technology and the training and you say, oh, well, the training made a difference. It is true, we can see in those objective scores that there was a difference, but what was somewhat more interesting, and probably more of an explanation for why it was working, was the whole act of training got them using the material more. And so you see the total activities is greater. These are all voluntary again. The mobile versus computers, interesting, but not our point here. But the average time per activity and the number of activities collectively increased significantly. Now in 2018, or 2017, I think, 2017, 2018, he added a gamification layer on this as well. I'm not going to talk about that, but by simply setting up a leaderboard and dividing students into teams that competed against each other, he got some additional increases in these scores beyond what he got just with the training. So his training plus a little bit of gamification made a difference. Okay, I'm going to go back now to this. So again, if you're interested, the talk is there. We never did end up writing this up into a formal paper, but I think Glenn is including it in a book he's working on. Okay, the next area that I'm going to do, or actually the first three areas, looks like I've got about 15 minutes left, are the three parts where I think teachers need to help students develop. The first is selecting resources. So I mentioned that pleasure notion. The most important element of selecting good listening resources, if you're working on your own, and arguably even if you're a teacher trying to help students, is select interesting material. And that's much easier to do if you just have an audience of one as a learner. A second thing that may not be as obvious, but this draws from work in second language acquisition as well as in general cognitive psychology, is familiar material. If you are working with something that you already have a good background in, you already have, knowledge schemata for it, then you're going to be able to pay a little more attention to the language coming in. If you're dealing with something entirely new, I mentioned this cognitive resource limitations point. If you're dealing with something entirely new and it's got new language, dealing with new language and new content simultaneously may be interesting, may be entertaining, but it's not as good for supporting learning. So for example, instead of having students watch a news broadcast, hear about something that's happening on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast in California, I would have them work with something very local here, or listen to a news story in English, but about their native country, or about some other area that they know about. I think it's critical to have material with text support, if you, particularly for the vocabulary development part of it, whether that's transcripts or captions. And if captions, whether it's full captions or partial captions, you need something if you're going to have students try to pull out vocabulary on their own. In my listening class, the first week, I assigned them to watch a short video. It's about 15 minutes long, on Nikola Tesla. And it does not have text support, doesn't have captions or a transcript. And I asked them to try to pull out at least 5 new vocabulary items, words or phrases. And they come back and say, wow, it was really hard because when I heard something and didn't understand it, I wasn't able to write it down and look it up. And so that was a lesson for them. Correctly leveled material. This can get very tricky, especially if you're working on your own. When I say correctly leveled, I should say roughly leveled. Something that has enough challenge in it that there's something you can learn from it, but that is not too far beyond your current abilities. People use Ideas like, 95% of the vocabulary is already known. Without getting into quantifying that, at least if you can get a sense of, where the material is versus you. So if you have material that has a transcript, you can put it into Tom Cobb's vocabulary profiler here, and it'll strip it out and tell you what words and what percentages of words are at the various 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, etc., all the way up to the 25,000 word level in using the British National Corpus and the Corpus of Contemporary American English. It's a wonderful resource. I used it for several years as a teacher before I started introducing it to my students, and it became something that they were required to at least try out to see if it could help them find vocabulary level. Just a couple of quick examples of the sort of material, dedicated material, meaning it was designed for language learning, and then authentic material. These are some of the more popular sites with my students. The ESL lab is a little bit more basic, but some students still found it comfortable and especially useful in listening to more conversational language. So even though we're not working with interactive language, it's one-way communication, there's a difference between listening to lectures, listening to TED Talks, for example, and listening to dialogues, or ultimately, listening to entertainment material, movies, TV shows, and so on, which have conversation at their core. I'm going to go over this fairly quickly, but my advice to students, rather than just going out and finding something to listen to, is to make collections of things that they would like to listen to later, because the act of searching takes some time. And if you decide, okay, I'm going to spend 30 minutes searching for stuff, bringing it together into a folder, or in some form having the links and maybe even some annotations for them, that's going to be more efficient than going out and getting one thing, listening to it, and then somewhat later going out and getting another thing. This is actually aimed at teachers, initially, where you collect and organize material. You do this with some human intervention. There is such a thing as digital curation. My Google News feed is done entirely without, at least according to Google, without a human intervening. And so it bases it entirely on what's out there, breaking news that's popular, but also on its model of me as someone who reads Google News. That's not the kind of curation I'm talking about. This is where the human is involved. So the teacher, as the curator, has to collect the material, organize it in some way, just like you would if you're a museum curator and you're setting up a room in your museum. You have to sequence it. Well, you don't have to, but often it's good rather than that sequence just being random. Find some logical way of organizing, in other words, not just into collections, but so that there's a path through that makes sense. Provide some language level information if you're setting this up for students so that they know, is this going to be useful for them given their current language level? And add some kind of pedagogical support. This can be very brief. Could just be material that from the original site. With TED Talks, for example, you can just clip off the description of the talk and put that in so that there's a little bit of pre-listening that students can use, and also a brief description of what they're going to see so they can decide whether it's worth their time, whether it really will, if it's at the right level, be something of interest to them. The goal here is not just to put it together for the class, but also to demonstrate how to do this so that students are being able to learn how to do it on their own. They become aware of what the process, what the points are, those 5 points, maybe not the 5th one, but what those points are, and they become aware of what the process is for doing that. This is something that I've had suggested to me. I didn't get around to trying it out, but letting students produce their own curated content and then share with other students. That by itself, particularly within an integrated skills class, could be interesting. The type of content qualities, again, this is from the perspective of a teacher, that they have these characteristics. What I discovered was some of the stuff I used initially actually violated my university's policy, because just because it was up on YouTube didn't mean it was legally up on YouTube. And then having the good technical quality, the stability. If you go through the work of doing this, you want to be able to come back to it. Here are 3 examples, and again, I'm running a little short of time here, and I want to keep close to the target since I don't want to push everything else back. This first link is to a set of curated TED Talks that I did for my listening class. The second link is to a company called LingoRank, which has taken a large number of TED Talks. They've indexed them to the Common European Framework levels. Mine uses words per minute for a measure of difficulty, and then the vocabulary profile. The LingoRank uses similar things. They're able to get to syllables per second because they have better technology than I do. And then the Khalil Store project is one from it's a European project where they have audio and video text for all kinds of languages, with the transcripts linked to multilingual dictionaries. And these again are ranked, so if you're looking for something for beginners, for A1 or A2 level, you can find it there. All right, online tools and resources. Again, these are, those of you who work in listening are already familiar with a lot of these, so I'm going to go through most of this, but I do want to point out just a little bit about media players. My favorite media player is the VLC player, partly because it not only has what every other media player has, but it's open source, and it has speed controls. It also has what are called jump controls, and it has a graphic equalizer. So this is an example of a talk from Stanford's eCorner. That's Marissa Mayer, formerly of Google and then CEO of Yahoo. And I'm not sure what she's up to now, but she's one of the ones I like to use because she talks fast, even though she's very clear. And so here you can see she's been slowed down to 82%. This is the speed control here. If you use a shift and back arrow, or shift and a forward arrow, mostly the shift back arrow, it jumps back 2 to 3 seconds. And that's an incredibly useful loop for language learning, rather than having to use the slider when you want to repeat. So look for media players that have that option if you can find them. This just shows how you can use the graphic equalizer to boost the mid-range that's more connected to human speech. Media players are generally optimized more for music, but in any event, this is a way of boosting those middle frequencies that are important for speech distinctions, just making it a little bit easier to hear. The last level, the strategies. One of the things I have to work with the students on throughout the first half of the course is that just because you understood something doesn't mean you're done with it. And especially if you're trying to really learn. There are a lot of really good technology-mediated listening strategies in the Rost and Wilson book. And one of the things that I've done year by year is I've asked students in the last class when they do their final report for me. My students, by the way, do a three-hour a week independent project. So a lot of the information I have about what they're doing and how they're doing it comes through the reports of those and through individual meetings I have 4 or 5 times a quarter with them. So that we go, this is an ongoing cycle of students try something, they say what they did, what was challenging, what was easy, and they get feedback from me either through writing or through face-to-face interaction. So this is a link to advice that students at the end of the course give to students who are going to take the course in the future. And it's got some interesting points in it, including what are their favorite strategies. So these are examples of objectives. I do push for the idea that students need to not just comprehend more effectively, and you can see all the details there. They also need to do work on improving their processing. And processing doesn't just mean getting the meaning out, it also means being able to capture the form. And this is where, among other things, having the text support is important. So being able to listen to faster speech, being able to accommodate accents. We have a very international campus. So a student from China might have a professor from India or from South America. And then making processing more automatic, getting it more accurate, actually starting to pay attention to grammar and linkages and so on, being able to process faster so that you have more time to think about it, and then building capacity. For increasing language knowledge, that's pretty straightforward. Understanding the sound system, the building vocabulary especially, but also recognizing that grammar is useful in comprehension, not just in speaking and writing. This is an example of a dictation exercise I have them do, and then they try it out and tweak this procedure on their own. This is what a lesson plan for an individual might look like. And they have a great deal of flexibility in how they go through material. Sometimes, occasionally it's just a single pass, but usually it's multiple passes for one reason or another. Basically, the students in my class, by the time they finish, they know how to do these things. Whether they do them or not after they leave my class is entirely up to them, but I've equipped them now to be more autonomous. Okay, just a couple of minutes over here to conclude. Again, there's the link on the bottom to my my website that has these slides. That's also in the chat. I haven't said much about research here. There's a lot of research underlying what I do, and even some research I've done. But what I've discovered is that while research is really good for guiding things, it has a lot of limitations, especially when you start working with individualizing things. And so keeping some sort of dialogue going on with your students is very important, and letting them work with each other. If you're going to do research, be sure you have some qualitative elements to it, not just quantitative. If your situation allows it, try this out and start small. Don't necessarily build a whole course. I didn't. This course accumulated over years into what it finally became. If you can, work with others, either maybe people you meet at a conference like this online, or maybe others in your own working group. This is an example of a group at a community college in New Jersey that worked together after using technology for a number of years to try to figure out how to help their students become better learners through learner training. And one last point here, I taught a course called Learning English on Your Own for about 5 years in the summer. It was aimed at students who would only be here for 6 weeks in the summer, and it has a large listening component, but it also has other skills. If you just want to see what some of the ideas I had back in 2012 were, there's a link. Again, those are my slides. I'm going to pop over to here. That's just the list of references. I will go back and end with this slide, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil, for a very insightful and informative presentation. I think there is a lot of materials, as you already said there, and anyone willing to start learner training or a class on listening could get lots of ideas to start with it. Now, we invite the audience to open their microphones and turn on their cameras and ask any questions that you may have for Phil. Also, if you would like just to use the chat room feature, please go ahead. Any questions? Do we have any questions for Phil?
I know this often happens.
No.
Well, let me, while people are maybe still thinking about it a little bit more, I did want to say even though I've built this around a listening class, I recognize that most people don't work in a setting where they have a skills curriculum. We work at a fairly high level and continued with a skills-based curriculum because our students come in with so many differences from all over the world. Some of them don't need any help. Some of them need help just with writing. Some need help more with listening than they do with speaking. Others need help more with speaking than listening. Even though this is a skills-based curriculum, within my class, all of the students are working on all the skills. So they get together, they have discussions in English about what they're doing. When we're in class, I might present a piece of material and then have them break into groups and share their notes and see what they got from it. In fact, maybe what I'll do here, just to
we have, maybe Phil, we have a couple of questions in the chat room.
Okay, great.
We do. We have a question. We have actually a couple of questions and lots of thank you for a very interesting talk. Okay. But in particular, Catherine Glass says, thank you so much for a very inspiring and interesting talk. I love the playing the double bass metaphor. So lots of success on that. Also, we have a question from Susan who is asking us, okay, interesting, but how can we assess listening with this type of project? Is that the focus?
Let me see. Okay. Oh, I got it here. Okay. How can we assess? Okay. So the first one was, how can we start? So that's why I put the start small there. The way to go, I think, is to give students an opportunity to do, I'm trying to go back all the way to my experience as a child growing up when I was learning to read. And somewhere around age 10 or 11, I started having to do reading on my own and writing out a very simple book report.
Right.
So what did I read? You know, it would have a form and it would put in a few things. you can do the same thing with listening at a fairly low level. And again, this is why I think it might be useful to start with curated material. So if you, let's say you collect a dozen videos that you think are at a level where your students can access them, maybe not listen to them in a normal way that they would say if they were a little more advanced, but something that's useful. Some people have suggested using children's material, for example, with beginning students. But it could be songs, it could be anything. But get them used to the idea that they can go out and try something on their own and then come back and report about it. I've always been fond of group work, even before it was kind of built into the, even before we got to the sociocultural turn in second language acquisition. I just think it's more interesting. And so get them, allow them, depending on how your class is set up, you can allow them to use their first language to talk about what they did in their second language. But just start with something small like that. And talk to other people about it. This is what I've given you is a very high level class that, as I say, has evolved over 20 years with students who are already in a second language setting. So they're highly motivated to get better, because they're going to be, if they're PhD students, they're going to be using English for the next 5 years at least. And many of them want to do postdocs here. They want to maybe become professors. If they're in master's programs, they want to finish a 2-year master's program and then get a job in Silicon Valley, even if they then go home, after their visa status changes. Or they may want to stay in an English medium international technology setting, even if they're doing it back home. So all kinds of, I have ideal students, I guess is what I'm saying, for doing something like this. And there are still challenges. So you need to know your students well enough to know what might work, but just do some experiments. And take a look at that Teaching English Reflectively with Technology book. There are, I think, 20 case studies in there that are, sometimes from teachers doing their first write-up of the material that they've been doing. We had a mentoring system for that. So if they weren't sure how to write up their materials, we had call experts that could help them with that. Okay, let me move on to the next question because we're running out of time here. Why don't you call them out for me, Monica, because that's easier than me.
Phil, we have a question from Marco, but I don't think we have much time now because we have 1 minute. So it says, my question is, why do you think that lower level students may struggle with independent learner? Do you think that an approach based on strategies can help them become more aware of their learning and improve this skill?
Yeah, I can give a quick answer to that, which is I haven't worked much with low-level learners, so this is what I get from other people's research. You'll see people doing research on, say, a beginning and an intermediate group and say, well, the intermediate group was able to do this, but the beginning level wasn't. I would suggest taking a look at doing a search for some of that research, but also thinking yourself about what it's like to learn anything new and what kind of support you find is most helpful. So don't ask students to go out and find their own materials, figure out how to go through it, and then come back. They're going to be, they're going to be playing the bass like this.
Exactly.
So that's my response. But I do think that, building the idea that students can have more control, even at beginning levels, is important. You just need to take smaller steps. Give them a choice of maybe, here are 3 videos, pick one of them.
Yep.
So now they have this idea of choice, but there's still enough under teacher control. Okay. And yeah, if you want to, we
can perhaps send these questions to you. Yeah, we're copying and pasting these questions for you. So we're gonna put together a document and send it to you through email. So
Okay,
maybe
I'll do my best to answer.
excellent. And once again, thank you so much, Phil, for accepting our invitation to be one of the keynote speakers. Again, a presentation full of ideas for classroom practice, for research, and for everything. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Monica, and good luck with the rest of the conference. I'll try and pop in from time to time if I can.